Imagine standing at the foot of the Alps, gazing up at the snow-capped peaks. Hannibal's army faced this very view long ago, carrying with them a burden no one expected. According to ancient sources, 37 war elephants. These colossal creatures, symbols of might and dread, were led toward terrain that seemed impossible even for men on foot. How did they endure such a crossing? Tonight, we'll explore not only their survival, but also the quiet wonder they stirred, and the immense cost tied to Hannibal's vision. To begin, we need to ask why he chose to bring them at all. For Hannibal, bringing elephants across the Alps was not a wild impulse, but a calculated choice. Many in his camp doubted the wisdom of leading such animals into snow and rock. Yet he insisted. To him, elephants were not just beasts of burden. They were engines of fear and force, capable of breaking Roman formations and unnerving soldiers unaccustomed to their sight and sound. In ancient warfare, an elephant could serve several roles. It might charge directly into enemy lines, carry men armed with bows or javelins, or simply stand as a moving symbol of power. Armies that had never faced them often hesitated or broke formation before the real fighting began. Hannibal understood that this edge in morale mattered as much as numbers. The mountains would strain the elephants' endurance, but if even a few survived into Italy, their presence could tilt the balance. The hardest question was not their military value, but their survival. Marching with elephants meant constant pressure on supplies. They demanded vast amounts of food and frequent water. Modern studies speak of daily intakes in the hundreds of pounds. Each day of climbing heightened that burden. Their broad feet suited plains, not icy slopes, and their thick hides, though resistant to weapons, offered little comfort against mountain cold. Advisors argued that leaving them behind would speed the army and spare lives. Hannibal instead placed faith in preparation. Clear the paths, build temporary crossings, and guide them forward step by slow step. Most evidence suggests these were North African forest elephants, smaller than the great Indian elephants often depicted in art. They stood a little over 2 meters tall, which made them somewhat easier to manage in rough terrain. Ancient writers also mention a single large elephant, often called Surus, possibly Syrian or Asian in type, but his presence remains uncertain. What we can say with some confidence is that Hannibal's herd reflected both the limits and ambitions of Carthage. Rare creatures brought from across the empire, harnessed for war. Training them demanded skill as much as strength. Mahouts, the handlers, rode near the animal's head, guiding them with calls and pressure behind the ears. A frightened elephant could do more damage to its own ranks than to the enemy, so discipline mattered. Some traditions claim African elephants were harder to tame while Asian elephants obeyed more readily, but modern scholars caution against firm conclusions. In practice, temperament varied, and the steady hand of an experienced handler counted most. Scouting the Alpine routes was the next challenge. Some passes were too narrow or too steep. Others offered easier ground but delayed the march, giving Rome more time to prepare. Hannibal weighed each path as a gamble. He chose speed and surprise, even knowing the elephants might not endure the cost. To ease the strain, the army likely rested them at intervals where scrub or grass remained below snow level. Cold alone did not kill them. It was hunger and exhaustion that loomed over every step. What this decision revealed was Hannibal's way of thinking. The elephants were both practical tools and bold symbols. Their survival into Italy would signal that Carthage could do what seemed beyond reach. Even coins and monuments after the war carried their image, a reminder of how they captured imagination as well as fear. When their huge shapes finally moved toward the lower Alpine slopes, they carried more than men or supplies. They carried the message that obstacles might be endured rather than avoided. That choice would shape every mile of the coming march, as thousands of soldiers and dozens of elephants began their climb toward Rome's heartland. In late spring of 218 BC, the Great March began. Hannibal's army gathered in Iberia, ready to move north toward the heart of enemy lands. Estimates vary, but ancient writers describe tens of thousands of soldiers leaving with him, along with the famous 37 elephants. Preparing for this departure took months. Food had to be secured, routes scouted, and the elephants trained for steady travel. Their handlers, or mahouts, would remain close to each animal, walking alongside each day of the long journey. The column moved less like a traditional army and more like a moving settlement. Supply carts, cavalry, pack animals, and the great elephants all demanded order and constant attention. Behind the soldiers stretched a trailing load of grain, fodder, and tools. The elephants shaped the pace more than anything else. Their need for frequent rest and vast amounts of forage meant the army advanced at a measured rhythm, with regular halts in open ground. At first, progress across friendly Celtiberian lands went smoothly. These communities provided grain and animals in exchange for payment or alliances. Still, the elephants drew wary crowds. Few had ever seen them before, and many livestock scattered in fright at their presence. Soldiers often kept watch to prevent curious onlookers from drawing too close, since the animals could react unpredictably after long days of marching. The size of the moving force added strain wherever it passed. Modern historians suggest the number of soldiers, attendants, and animals may have reached well above 50,000 people. This concentration quickly taxed food stocks. Even with caches prepared earlier along the route, shortages emerged. Grasslands fed the elephants at first, but as the land sloped upward, their forage grew thinner and less nourishing. Each new day demanded careful planning from those in charge of supplies. Crossing the Pyrenees offered the first real test. While less daunting than the Alps ahead, the mountains still pressed men and animals hard. Hannibal took a deliberate approach, leaving behind specific garrisons to secure his supply routes in Spain and to reduce the risk of desertion among new recruits. This adjustment thinned his marching numbers, but tightened his control. The elephants managed these first slopes, though loose rocks caused slips and constant tension. Steep descents proved even more difficult. Balance and careful guidance from the mahouts kept the animals safe, but the preview of hardship remained clear. After weeks of progress, the army reached the Rhone River. Broad and fast, the river was too deep to ford on foot. Here, ingenuity kept the march alive. Soldiers built rafts wide enough to hold 2 elephants at a time, binding them against the current with ropes anchored from the shore. Guided by their mahouts, the elephants stepped onto these makeshift platforms. Some hesitated, swaying with fear. One panicked and nearly tipped into the water before its handler calmed it. But eventually, every elephant crossed, an effort that astonished local Gallic observers. Beyond the Rhone, conditions grew harsher. Nights turned cooler, grass thinned, and marching slowed even further as Hannibal's scouts led the army northeast toward the Alps. Food for the elephants became one of the central difficulties. Each delay, whether for grazing or repair, brought danger. Time lost could mean Roman patrols cutting them off, or sudden weather shifts closing the high passes. Hannibal pressed on, knowing that speed was as vital as endurance. The army itself evolved along the way. Some Iberian fighters slipped back after the Pyrenees crossing, while new Gallic allies joined in for promises of plunder. Yet all 37 elephants still stood in their lines, checked daily for injuries or signs of fatigue. Lighter loads were stacked on their backs now, but their broad feet still slid on loose stones, a struggle that worsened as the trail steepened. By early autumn, the Alps came fully into view. Chilling winds swept across the ridges, and the first signs of snow appeared high above. Each giant step of the elephants now represented immense labor, but also a striking vision that stayed in the mind of all who saw them. Their presence stirred more than simple curiosity. It raised emotions, an awe for some, and deep unease for others, that would soon prove as powerful as any weapon carried on the march. So what mattered next was not only the march itself, but how those elephants were seen. Their presence carried a heavy psychological impact that often proved as decisive as any weapon. For Carthaginian allies, elephants stirred confidence. Soldiers who had fought beside them before trusted their strength in battle. Those encountering them for the first time felt wonder at beasts so large they seemed almost unnatural. Within the army, the sight of elephants in their own ranks gave men more discipline and faith that they carried something the Romans could not match. Among Roman forces and their allies, the reaction was far different. Roman reports described the animals in fearful, exaggerated terms, often stressing their bulk and strange sounds. Horses balked and refused to face them, unseating riders before combat even began. Ancient sources repeatedly emphasize the shock value of these unfamiliar animals. They unsettled not only men but whole units of cavalry, giving Hannibal an advantage before a formal battle line had even been drawn. The Gallic tribes living along the route reacted in varied ways. Some were drawn by curiosity or treated the elephants as signs of divine approval and joined Hannibal's march. Others kept away, intimidated by creatures they believed carried supernatural power, and some still tried to raid the camps, only to scatter when alarm calls from elephants echoed across the valleys. Reactions ranged from fear to fascination, and Hannibal used that variation to his advantage, securing supplies and paths with less bloodshed. Accounts of specific encounters underline this. At the Rhone crossing, for instance, local groups who had gathered in opposition gave way when they saw the elephants approach the river. Witnessing them step onto rafts convinced many that resistance was pointless. Similar reports followed the army's progress, as word of these strange creatures traveled faster than the soldiers themselves. Why did elephants disturb so many? In ancient warfare, the unfamiliar often held greater power than sheer numbers. Here was an animal larger than any ox, louder than any storm, capable of sweeping men aside as though they were nothing. Their smell carried on the wind. Their trumpet calls seemed to come from another world. Soldiers reached for explanations in myth before they reached for their weapons. Hannibal understood how to use this fear. He placed elephants where they would be seen first, at the head of his column when entering new territories or facing uncertain allies. In these moments, their presence worked as negotiation as much as threat. Leaders faced a stark choice: stand in the path of giants or talk. Many chose to talk. The effect reached beyond the battlefield. Stories grew faster than the army could march. Cities ahead heard descriptions of monsters larger than truth. Some opened their gates without waiting to see. In a way, each retelling made the elephants more powerful in imagination than they were in flesh. Within Carthage's own ranks, the handlers of the elephants became figures of respect. They calmed the animals, guided them through danger, and reassured weary troops that these living towers were under control. That steady partnership between man and beast reminded the army that what seemed wild could still be mastered. Roman commanders tried to undo this imbalance. They spread claims that elephants were clumsy, slow, and easy to defeat once understood. Training began to accustom troops to their sight and sound. Yet in those first encounters, the animal's reputation outpaced any Roman countermeasure. Over time, enemies would learn that elephants were not invincible, that fire, noise, and tight spaces could throw them into chaos. But by then their impact was established. In the early phase of the campaign, they had already changed choices, opened roads, and shifted morale. That mental edge was as much a part of the Alpine journey as food or shelter, and it set the stage for the next physical challenge, where Hannibal's army, elephants included, confronted nature itself in a way no words or rumors could soften. Crossing wide rivers was the next true measure of Hannibal's ambition. Among them, the Rhone became the first great test. The stream here was broad and fast, with currents that could sweep away animals and men alike. Moving infantry and horses was challenge enough, but the elephants carried risks no standard ferry could solve. Their weight, their nervousness in water, and the possibility of sudden panic meant that a single failure could turn the crossing into disaster. Ancient sources tell us Hannibal did not rely on one method alone. He acquired local boats, pressed his engineers to build timber rafts, and sent a detachment under Hanno to secure a position farther upstream. With this circuit completed, the main body could cross under protection. The carpenters lashed rafts together to create floating platforms strong enough for the elephants. They scattered soil and brush over the surfaces, disguising them as firm ground. It was simple psychology. If the animals thought they stood on land, they would step forward. The first task was persuading the elephants to mount the rafts at all. Handlers worked in pairs and used steady signals, the tap of a stick, a spoken tone, to calm them. Some animals resisted, swaying back and stamping. At those moments, a mahout's touch became the only safeguard. Once on the platforms, ropes ran taut to the far bank. Men hauled against the current to draw each load slowly across. It was tedious work, done in stages, with adjustments at every length of rope. The ancient accounts also offer colorful details. Some tell how an agitated bull nearly toppled into the water, or how a younger elephant slipped free. Other writers describe elephants venturing indirectly, trunks lifted as breathing tubes, wading or swimming when the depth allowed. Naturalists today consider that plausible, especially in shallower sections, though the stories themselves grew more dramatic in later retellings. The heart of the matter is that the crossing was possible only with patience and a mix of engineering tricks. The effort did not finish quickly. Instead, it unfolded over several days and many passes. Infantry and cavalry made use of ferries and shallow fords, while the elephants consumed most of the crew's energy and attention. Guards stood watch against curious tribes on the banks, though few dared interfere once they saw the Carthaginians' resourcefulness. Each part of the riverbank became a worksite, ropes tightening, men hauling, mahouts guiding tusks and trunks. At last, the army stood together again on the far side. It was a moment for regrouping. Grass and brush along the river fed the elephants after their strain, and the humans also needed pause before pushing into harder ground. Yet the pace of movement revealed an ongoing truth. The elephants slowed everything, shaping not just tactics but the rhythm of the march itself. Looking back, the Rhone crossing teaches us two things. First, Hannibal and his crews blended known methods, boats, rafts, and diversionary tactics, into solutions tailored to their unusual burden. Second, the successful passage carried weight beyond the practical. News spread quickly that even the elephants had crossed, a fact that impressed allies and unsettled observers. It confirmed that Hannibal's march was not a bold claim but a working reality. This triumph over water helped sustain faith within the ranks. Soldiers who doubted found fresh courage in the sight of elephants landing on solid ground after days of risk. But the Rhine-like river, for all its difficulty, was still a gentler trial than what lay ahead. Once the waters were behind them, the army's path turned toward colder air and harsher inclines, where footing and endurance, not floating timbers, would determine survival. The ascent into the Alps marked the most punishing stage of Hannibal's march. As the army climbed higher, the elephants faced obstacles unlike anything in their natural world. Narrow trails clung to cliff sides, and snow concealed sudden drops. Their broad feet, built for softer ground, slipped often on ice and loose rock. Every upward step demanded constant guidance from handlers and work crews carving paths just wide enough for the animals to pass. Cold weather quickly became just as threatening as the terrain. Elephants tolerate heat far better than frost, and they weakened in the thin, frigid air. Mahouts rubbed their hides with oils and tried wrapping their feet for protection, but the measures held little against the mountain chill. Ancient authors describe soldiers clearing ice, rebuilding paths after landslides, and even cutting new steps into frozen slopes. Some accounts add that at especially narrow crossings, entire days vanished into widening the track before the animals could move forward again. Snow fell steadily, with deep drifts hiding rocks and crevices beneath. Scouts walked ahead, prodding with poles, though even then elephants sometimes broke through. Extraction was slow and dangerous, with ropes and levers straining under the weight. Supplies thinned at the same time. Alpine grasses offered little nourishment, and stores carried from earlier stages ran short. A later report, probably Livy, claims Hannibal turned to an ingenious but disputed method, using fire and vinegar to fracture boulders blocking the path. Polybius does not mention this, and most scholars now see it as embellishment, but the story reflects the sense of desperation that marked the ascent. Besides the natural elements, the Carthaginians also faced ambushes from local tribes. Rocks and missiles rained down from high ridges, pinning the column on narrow paths. Soldiers fought uphill while guarding the elephants below, working to keep the animals from panicking in confined spaces. Accounts describe casualties and near disasters, with handlers coaxing their charges to stay calm amid the chaos. When the army finally gained higher ground, Hannibal gathered his men at a summit clearing. He pointed eastward, toward the plains of Italy visible beyond the peaks, reminding them of why the ordeal continued. That moment of rally helped steady morale, though the hardest work was still ahead. The descent proved worse than the climb. Loose scree, ice, and avalanches made downward slopes perilous. Engineers built ramps reinforced with timbers to keep animals from tumbling off ledges. The sounds of shifting rock and frightened trumpeting echoed across valleys, a reminder of how thin the margin for survival was. Some elephants did make it through, but not all. Ancient historians and modern scholars agree that the majority did not survive the Alpine passage. Estimates vary, but the consensus is clear. Only a fraction reached Italy, yet those survivors carried weight far beyond their numbers. Their endurance spoke to the years of training that bound mahout and elephant together. Against mountains, hunger, and constant danger, progress was possible only through that partnership. These survivors also shaped memory. What had seemed nearly impossible was proven just enough. Among the elephants that endured, one in particular stood out to ancient writers. His story became more than survival. It became a symbol that lingered long after the snow and stone had been left behind. Among the elephants remembered from Hannibal's march, one name stands out in ancient tradition: Surus, often called the Syrian. Some writers describe him as a larger, stronger elephant than the rest, perhaps distinct from the North African elephants that made up most of the herd. His exact origins remain debated. He may have been of Syrian stock brought west through trade, or simply a particularly impressive African elephant given a foreign title. What matters is that his name survived when nearly all other details faded. The very fact that Surus carried a personal name gives him a special place in the story. Ancient accounts suggest he may have been Hannibal's chosen mount during parts of the Italian campaign. If so, soldiers would have seen commander and elephant together as one symbol of persistence. Even in uncertainty, that image holds weight. It reminds us that armies at the time attached meaning and morale not only to leaders, but also to chosen animals who bore them. Descriptions of Surus vary, and we must read them with care. Some highlight his patience in waiting while paths were cleared, noting how he advanced steadily when others balked. Others credit him with playing a role in early battles on Italian soil, breaking formations with his size. Whether these reports describe one specific elephant or turn several incidents into one figure is hard to say. What is clear is that stories of endurance and calm were gathered under his name. Modern historians generally agree that only a small number of elephants survived the Alpine passage. Ancient writers then single out Surus as among them, possibly the last to remain fit for service in Italy. That level of survival, whether singular or shared, made him a natural subject of tale and remembrance. In a campaign where thousands perished, it is not surprising that a single enduring figure, human or animal, would become emblematic. We do not need to know precise details of size, lineage, or training to grasp his importance. Surus became a rallying point for Hannibal's men, an emblem of stability when food ran short and the landscape itself seemed too hostile. Seen this way, he was less a biological specimen and more a reminder that the extraordinary could be endured so long as even one stood strong beside them. He was remembered not because of his species, but because of the effect his presence had on those around him. Later interpretations gave Surus even more mythic qualities. Some Roman writers imagined him surviving longer than all the rest, or even continuing into decisive battles near the end of the war. Others pointed to him as a symbol of Hannibal's audacity, the last marker of a campaign that had carried beasts from distant lands across Europe's highest peaks. Whether these accounts magnify or distort, they confirm the impact of a single animal on collective memory. Surus reminds us that history is not only made by leaders and armies in the aggregate, but also by the individuals, sometimes even non-human ones, who embody endurance, resilience, and shared struggle. His story, however fragmented, captures the idea that meaning in history often clusters around a single name or figure through which wider experiences are recalled. And as the army pushed forward into lands beyond the mountains, that figure would take on an added dimension. Wherever the elephants went, people encountered them for the very first time. The reactions to what they saw, fear, awe, ritual respect, became just as important to Hannibal's progress as the animals themselves. When Hannibal's column finally moved among the Alpine tribes, the encounters carried weight beyond simple diplomacy. For communities used to oxen and horses, the elephants were unlike anything they had seen. Accounts suggest reactions ranged widely. Some stepped back in fear, while others stood fascinated at the strangeness before them. The first meetings were less about battles and more about perception, shaped by shock at unfamiliar scale and movement. Hannibal recognized how these responses could influence outcomes. When approaching uncertain groups, he often placed elephants in sight of local leaders. One memorable story tells of a chieftain, prepared to demand costly tribute, who changed his stance entirely after watching the animals up close. What might have turned into armed resistance instead became cooperation. In this way, the elephants worked as silent negotiators, proof that Carthage carried extraordinary strength into the mountains. Some tribes explained what they saw through spiritual language. Without a framework for such creatures, they treated them as omens or portents, worked into existing beliefs about the natural and divine. Ritual gestures, blessings, and quiet offerings marked encounters that could have become hostile. Hannibal allowed these practices, knowing that acceptance of the strange often opened safer paths than force of arms. There were practical effects too. Moving an army of this scale required constant access to food and guides, and Hannibal could not afford to fight for every valley. He paid locals, exchanged goods, and in some cases found the elephants themselves prompted trade. Their need for fodder introduced new exchanges, as tribes gathered plants or stored grain to supply the passing force. In return, they received foreign goods or protection for their own caravans. Not everyone welcomed the animals in the same way. Younger warriors sometimes pushed close to test their courage, and handlers had to keep the animals under tight control to prevent missteps. A few incidents ended badly, and warnings spread quickly. These dangers only sharpened the impression that the elephants were beings to approach with care, not just strange beasts passing through. Over time, a different pattern appeared. At first, people watched from ridges and distances. Later, small groups drew nearer, offering food or services, or simply following the march to marvel again. The sudden intrusion of these animals into their valleys shifted from shock into a kind of uneasy accommodation. What had seemed monstrous became woven into stories, symbols, and even simple trade across regions once closed to Carthage. This shift mattered more than we might think. Tribes that bent their stance because of elephants did not do so out of defeat. They did it out of calculation that working with Hannibal could open opportunity and protection. That quiet turn of choice, shaped not by battle but by what was seen on a mountain path, added to the momentum of the army's progress. As the march left these valleys behind, the elephants remained at the heart of both fear and cooperation. But ahead, the greatest strain was no longer how people reacted, but how the animals themselves could be kept safe on trails that turned sharp and downward. The real measure of survival would come when the army faced the steep descent beyond the high passes. The downward paths demanded as much ingenuity as courage. Where climbing had tested endurance, descending brought sudden danger of slips and falls. The steep slopes were often a patchwork of ice, snow, and loose gravel. One wrong step could send soldiers or elephants plunging down ridges with little chance of recovery. The only way forward was to change the mountain itself, cutting, shaping, and steadying until even the heaviest animals could begin to move again. Hannibal's men turned to the simplest tools. They hacked rough steps into rock and ice where the path narrowed, laid supports of timber where slopes broke away, and raised makeshift ramps when ground gave out beneath them. Soldiers built these works slowly under biting cold, shifting earth by hand and shoulder. Each hour of chipping stone and packing snow brought another few feet of safe passage. Progress was measured not in miles, but in ledges won. Some later accounts add colorful details of unusual tricks. One tradition tells of handlers lighting fires on the slopes, leaving charred patches that the elephants avoided, as if guided by instinct toward safer ground. Historians today treat such stories as drawings from memory and embellishment, yet they remind us just how desperate the search for solutions had become. Men observed, experimented, and took from whatever seemed to work, even if only for a few cautious steps. The animals themselves showed surprising resourcefulness. Observers noticed them pausing before treacherous spots, tapping with a trunk as though testing the way forward. Handlers learned to trust these signals just as much as their own scouting. Teams of mahouts clustered tightly around each elephant during the hardest descents. Younger ones were even tethered to steady companions, forming a moving line of guidance and restraint through narrow cuts in the mountain. Some obstacles forced the entire column to alter course. Landslides had torn away sections of track, leaving sheer drops. Rather than risk collapse, Hannibal chose detours that ate up precious days. Engineers carved out new sections of road by hand while the army waited, an investment of time that preserved animal and soldier alike. This willingness to delay for safety set the tone for the descent. Caution over speed, preservation over bravado. Snow drifted unevenly, another hidden trap. An elephant might stand on a crust of frozen powder, only for it to give way moments later. Scouts tested each stretch ahead with long poles, and where weakness showed, men rushed forward to pack the ground with branches. These quiet routines of inspection and repair carried as much importance as any weapon in the arsenal. Cold nights added fresh difficulties. Meltwater froze back into treacherous sheets by morning, forcing handlers to keep the animals moving in gentle circles on flatter ground rather than risk early starts on ice. The routine looked repetitive and slow, but it preserved strength for the harder passages that waited just below. What held everything together was the rhythm of constant adjustment. Soldiers shifted from cutting to shoring to hauling, attending to whatever the land required. Handlers learned to guide with patience instead of force, steadying the elephant's nerves with calm presence. Every solution grew not from plans drawn beforehand, but from watching, trying, and adapting in the moment. In the valleys near the end of the descent, melting snow turned into mudslides that threatened to swallow men and carts. Yet here the elephants, so often a burden, briefly became an asset. Their weight pressed the earth firm, their broad feet holding ground where horses slipped. For once, their size helped the column instead of slowing it. Looking back, what stands out is not a single brilliant technique, but the blending of muscle, observation, and persistence. The soldiers reshaped paths step by step, and the handlers matched their animals' instincts with care. Ingenuity here looked quiet rather than dramatic, born of labor that never stopped until earth and rock yielded. Soon, the army would leave the harsh slopes behind. But even after such effort, questions remained over what strength and numbers would still be left to fight. The journey itself had taken a great toll, and what had survived mattered as much as what had been lost. When Hannibal's weary army reached the open lands of northern Italy, the elephants that descended into the Po Valley stood out as shadows of their former strength. Ancient sources describe only a few surviving out of the original 37, though historians disagree on the exact number. Whether it was a handful or slightly more, the survivors were visibly gaunt, ribs sharp beneath stretched skin, their steps slowed by exhaustion. The losses had come from many directions. Some animals had fallen from narrow paths, others collapsed under strain in the highest passes, and many withered from cold and hunger. Observers in later accounts noted wounds from rock and ice, and the sight of handlers standing guard beside an elephant that no longer rose. The scale of death left even the strongest survivors worn thin, their hides scarred and their temperaments altered from the march. Those who did endure bore heavy signs of hardship. Reports describe cracked feet from the jagged terrain, swings in behavior from quiet refusal to march to restless calls that echoed through camp at night. To their handlers, these were not just animals enduring strain, but companions whose spirits had been tested much as their bodies had. The elephants pushed forward, but the weight of absence followed each step. Once in Italy, Hannibal prioritized their care. Soldiers gathered whatever fodder was available in the colder fields of the Po, combining dried grasses with softer plants to ease recovery. Carthaginian veterinarians applied herbal mixtures to treat injuries, binding feet and rubbing oils into cracked skin. These efforts were not sentimental alone. By this point, each surviving elephant represented real value, creatures rare and irreplaceable, their very survival a testament to the scale of effort already invested. Patterns of survival emerged, though not all could be explained. Younger elephants tended to falter first, while the very old moved stiffly and risked collapse on descents. Middle-aged animals, seasoned yet still resilient, formed most of those who remained. Above all, the bond between elephant and mahout often proved decisive. Handlers walked beside their charges through storms, guiding them across ice, sometimes laying down their own lives to calm a panicked beast so the others could continue. Such loyalty became part of the memory of the campaign itself. The reduced corps of elephants changed Hannibal's approach. No longer were they numerous enough to cover entire flanks or drive forward in mass. Instead, the survivors became a concentrated force, kept close and deployed sparingly. Their presence alone unsettled Roman scouts. Reports varied wildly. Some claimed far more remained out of fear, while others dismissed what they saw as too few to matter. This uncertainty served Hannibal's strategy, keeping opponents unsure how much weight to give the strange creatures now moving on Italian soil. Among them, tradition names at least one enduring figure, likely Surus, standing apart through both size and legend. But even he carried the visible marks of the passage. Veterans of the campaign described the elephants moving with slower, more deliberate steps, as though conserving strength for the battles still to come. Once engines of shock in Carthage's ranks, they now walked as living reminders of survival itself. Seen this way, the The survivors mattered less for their numbers than for their symbolic weight. Their survival proved that the Alps could be crossed, that what was thought to be impossible had in fact reached Roman soil. Soldiers guarded them with unusual devotion, and their quiet presence lent the Carthaginian army a sense of endurance and purpose. They were no longer just weapons. They had become emblems. What follows is where this symbol would be tested in combat. In the wide plains of northern Italy, Hannibal found himself face to face with Rome's first full attempt to block his advance. And here, the elephants, few as they were, stepped once more into the heart of battle. The first great clash with Rome on Italian soil came that winter, at the Battle of Trebia. It was fought on a cold December morning, with Hannibal's forces drawn up against a larger Roman army near the icy river. Among his troops stood the surviving elephants from the Alpine crossing. Though their numbers had been much reduced, Hannibal prepared them as a single striking group, knowing their impact would be felt as much in the minds of the Romans as in the fighting itself. At the outset, Hannibal kept the elephants just behind his infantry, hidden from early scouts. Snow had left the ground heavy and wet, conditions that made marching difficult for horses and men. Handlers bound the animals' feet with cloth to steady them in the mud. Roman observers, seeing only weary soldiers from the Alps, assumed this would be a conventional fight. They remained unaware of what waited behind the Carthaginian lines until the moment horns sounded and the battle began. Ancient accounts describe what followed in vivid terms. The elephants pushed through gaps in the infantry, revealing themselves to Roman troops for the first time. Reports speak of Roman cavalry mounts rearing in panic, throwing riders before contact. Formations that relied on close order wavered where the animals advanced, breaking apart under pressure. Hannibal's veterans pressed forward through these sudden openings, turning disorder into opportunity. Writers of the time also describe elephants as moving fortresses. Some carried archers who loosed arrows from raised positions. Others simply forced gaps by their bulk, pushing Romans into tighter spaces where spearmen could finish the work. One dramatic account even tells of animals striking near the Roman center, a moment said to have exposed high-ranking officers to direct attack. Whether embellished or not, these stories all stress the disruption created when the elephants appeared. The weather added to the strain. Roman soldiers fought with frozen hands and waterlogged armor, struggling to control swords and shields. By contrast, the elephants, rubbed with grease and attended constantly by their handlers, kept moving despite the cold. The contrast between shivering troops and steady animals only heightened the sense of imbalance. Attempts to bring the elephants down often faltered. Some legionaries tried to strike legs or trunks, but the animals never stood still long enough to be easy targets. Handlers urged them in bursts forward and back again, never letting the Romans settle on one response. Ancient writers note their unpredictability more than their raw destruction, making clear that the main effect came from alarm and confusion rather than slaughter. The final stage of the battle showed this most clearly. When Romans broke and fell back toward the Trebia River, Hannibal placed elephants along possible escape routes. Soldiers facing them chose icy water over confrontation. Many drowned or froze in retreat, their discipline collapsing. The elephants did little direct killing at this point, but their looming presence sealed the Carthaginian victory. Sources differ on whether any elephants were lost in the fighting. Some claim all emerged intact. Others mention one or two falling to concentrated missile fire. What we can say with more certainty is that their influence outweighed their numbers. They amplified Hannibal's tactics, adding sudden chaos to a day when Rome expected a straightforward contest. The result was devastating Roman losses compared to Hannibal's smaller casualties. For the survivors, Trebia was proof that the ordeal of the mountains had not been endured in vain. Their appearance in battle reshaped Roman expectations, spreading stories of monstrous beasts that unsteadied cavalry and broke ranks with ease. These tales followed the army long after, building a reputation stronger than the limited damage the animals had actually done. Yet this moment also raises a wider question. Why did these creatures matter so deeply, even when their real battlefield effect was more limited than the legends suggest? That tension between their role as weapons and their power as symbols is what we need to look at next. Elephants in warfare carried a strange paradox. They looked unstoppable, yet their performance on the battlefield rarely met the expectations set by their size. Their tactical impact was mixed, sometimes decisive at moments like Trebia, yet just as often dangerously unpredictable. Ancient writers record both spectacular breakthroughs and disastrous instances in which panicked elephants stampeded back through their own lines. Over time, Roman commanders learned simple countermeasures: fire, noise, or concentrated missile fire that could turn the giants into liabilities. The strain of keeping them in service only sharpened this problem. Each elephant consumed extraordinary amounts of fodder, far more than any group of soldiers. Armies had to dispatch foraging parties just to feed them. In winter campaigns, the difficulty multiplied, as feeding, watering, and sheltering the animals required improvisation. Even their hides, thick as armor, could not save them from cold exposure or frostbite in northern climates. Many never reached battle simply because care was too demanding. But despite these limitations, elephants remained present in armies for generations. The reason went beyond practical utility. A single elephant placed at the head of a column could alter how an army was perceived. They signaled wealth, reach, and command over distant lands. To allies they promised protection. To enemies they suggested unstoppable force. Hannibal grasped this fully. After the Alpine ordeal, the few that survived were no longer reliable as weapons of decision, but their appearance at the right moment was enough to inspire his soldiers and worry his opponents. We see the same instinct in Rome's response. Captured elephants were paraded through city streets, celebrated not for their combat value, but for their visual spectacle. Crowds gathered because these creatures embodied conquest itself. Rome even struck coins and built monuments displaying their image, compressing the meaning of foreign wars into the sight of a single imposing animal. The roots of this symbolism reached back into older traditions. In the Mediterranean world, elephants were tied to ideas of divine authority and royal majesty. Successors of Alexander used them not only in war but in ceremonies, amplifying the aura of power by placing rulers atop them like living thrones. In India, they carried long-standing associations with wisdom, rulership, and endurance. Carthage used them the same way. Coins stamped with elephant images circulated decades before Hannibal's march, cultivating an aura of exotic might. Even Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, had brought elephants into Iberian campaigns as deliberate displays meant to all local tribes. By the late 3rd century BC, this symbolic weight mattered more than battlefield results. Maintaining war elephants drained resources, required specialized trainers, and imposed endless logistical costs. Yet rulers absorbed those burdens because of prestige. An army without elephants looked provincial, while one with elephants announced imperial ambition. They operated like banners that walked of their own accord, costly, fragile, but unforgettable. Their image outlived their use. Roman poets and historians later turned Hannibal's Alpine crossing into metaphor, describing elephants through snow as symbols of human daring against nature. The reality of their limited combat role faded into a larger picture of willpower and endurance. Even in defeat, their symbolic role lingered. After Zama, Scipio's choice to allow Carthage a few elephants underscored this, not as a military concession, but as an acknowledgement of their cultural weight. In this sense, Hannibal's elephants remind us of something universal. Armies have always staged displays that matter as much for perception as for action. Modern parades of missiles or fleets work in much the same way. The principle is unchanged. A weapon can shape minds even when it changes little on the battlefield itself. So why keep using them? Because symbol and perception mattered as much as tactics. Hannibal's elephants were remembered not for what they destroyed, but for what they represented: possibility against the odds, and the vision of Carthage standing at Rome's gates. That made their journey all the more meaningful. Yet even symbols have limits, and at some point memory meets the end of flesh and bone. What became of those last elephants would leave a quieter, unresolved story still worth telling. By the time Hannibal's long campaign wound down, the elephants that had once thundered down the Alps had almost vanished from the battlefield. Ancient writers disagree on how the herd dwindled. Some say a few remained for years, shifting roles from active service to ceremonial display. Others hint that by the time of the final showdowns, none were left at all. The records thin to silence, and we are left with shadows of possibilities rather than firm numbers. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC is often mentioned in this context. Polybius suggests some elephants stood in Hannibal's line of battle, while Livy insists none did. If any were present, they were few, and certainly nothing like the massed force of Carthage's earlier wars. By then, any animals that had survived from the Alps would have been old, beyond the usual years of fighting. More likely, replacements had been sent from Carthage, arriving in small numbers, and even these did not turn the tide. What happened to the final group is not recorded clearly. Historians outline several possibilities. Some may have fallen in combat, whether at Zama or in smaller skirmishes during the retreat. Others could have been captured and brought into Roman hands, paraded as spoils of war. Transport back to Africa posed another barrier. Loading elephants onto ships was difficult even in peacetime, and near impossible in the chaos of evacuation. A quieter outcome is also possible, that some animals were retired into private collections or menageries, removed from their former battlefield roles and kept simply as curiosities. The fate of their handlers deserves notice too. Mahouts had spent years guiding and caring for these animals, often forming lifelong bonds. A few ancient accounts mention handlers surrendering with their elephants rather than abandon them. Though brief, these mentions show that the story of the elephants cannot be told without acknowledging the people who lived beside them, who calmed them during storms, and who shared the slow attrition of the march. Their fates, like the elephants, were left unrecorded. There are faint hints in the scattered sources that some elephants survived into later Roman contexts. Reports speak of African beasts, seen in arenas or kept in private estates, animals said to respond to commands in Punic. These fragments are intriguing but unprovable. Archaeology adds little clarity. Elephant bones unearthed near Carthaginian sites reveal battle damage, but cannot be tied with certainty to Hannibal's animals. Scientific approaches, such as isotope studies, have been tried, but results remain too ambiguous to settle the question. What is clear is that elephants gradually disappeared from Mediterranean wars in the generations that followed. Political changes made them less practical than before, and their place shifted from weapons of the battlefield to marvels of diplomacy and entertainment. Carthage was eventually reduced to memory, yet elephants did not vanish entirely. Instead, they lingered in Roman games, imperial menageries, and on coins that fixed their image into collective imagination. If anything, their uncertain end tells us how animals in history often recede once their symbolic role is spent. Leaders and generals are remembered with precision, their deaths carefully written down. War animals rarely receive the same closure. Their absence in the record is quiet, but perhaps it suits the way they lived, caught between nature, war, and human need. And while their final fate may never be fully known, their presence had already reshaped events. They forced choices, prompted adaptations, and showed both sides the power of the unexpected. What came next would not be about elephants themselves, but how their image and their challenge changed the people who faced them. The first Roman encounters with Hannibal's elephants showed how unprepared they were. At Trebia, trained legionaries lost their order when the animals advanced, and cavalry scattered before a fight even began. Rome's disciplined machine was refined for human enemies, not towering beasts guided with skill. The shock taught them how urgent it was to adapt. At first, they relied on familiar methods. Javelin volleys and tight infantry charges seemed logical, but they faltered. Wounded elephants did not always retreat. Some became uncontrollable, lashing out at anything nearby. Each failure forced adjustments. Rome learned fast, shifting formations, refining missile tactics, and concentrating on the handlers whose control mattered most. Once a mahout was struck down, an elephant often lost its direction. A weakness quickly turned into opportunity. New drills were soon introduced. Legion cohorts practiced opening spaces in their line, so the animals could be funneled through without direct collision. This broke the illusion of an unstoppable wall and replaced panic with routine steps. Light infantry took on greater importance, targeting legs or eyes. Knowing a disabled elephant mattered as much as one killed outright. Cavalry adapted too. Officers worked to condition their mounts to remain steady at the animal's smell and sound. Even bringing the troops closer to captured equipment, so fear could fade through familiarity. The Romans also experimented with tools and machinery. Artillery units tested concentrated volleys, learning that repeated fire to the legs slowed elephants more effectively than wounds elsewhere. Firepots and flares, while simple, unsettled the animals and bought time for infantry to reposition. Engineers tried temporary obstacles, though whether elaborate spiked wagons truly existed remains uncertain. What matters more is that Roman commanders encouraged their men to improvise, meeting novelty with small, practical changes. The psychological shift was just as important as the technical ones. Soldiers passed on accounts of how elephants moved and how they sounded. Hearing from men who had survived these encounters removed much of the mystery. Training shifted toward demystifying the beasts, turning terror into recognition and recognition into method. In this way, Rome steadily stripped away the shock value that Hannibal had first unleashed. By the final stages of the war, this process was clear to see. At Zama, Hannibal again led elephants into battle, but his opponents now anticipated them. Scipio arranged his maniples with deliberate lanes. When the animals charged, trumpets sounded, confusing their advance and steering them into safe corridors where they passed with little effect. What had once driven soldiers into panic now became a manageable part of the battlefield. The difference between Trebia and Zama shows how quickly Rome could transform weakness into strength. That cycle of reaction and countermeasure demonstrates something larger. Faced with an unfamiliar threat, Rome did not create one grand solution. It refined responses bit by bit, altering formations, retraining cavalry, and updating missile tactics. The lessons outlasted the elephants themselves, shaping discipline that proved valuable against later foes. What remains striking is how an enemy's innovation forced Rome into this process of trial and correction. Each adjustment came at a cost, yet each brought them closer to mastery. Understanding this arc matters not only for battles won and lost, but for how institutions evolve in moments of pressure. And while the story of tactics ends here, the question of the elephants themselves invites us to look elsewhere. If you step away from the battlefield, what we find next is the challenge modern historians and scientists face, reconstructing where they went, what paths they took, and how we can trace evidence on landscapes that still hold their silence. Modern investigators approach Hannibal's Alpine crossing with a different set of tools. Ancient authors like Polybius and Livy left descriptions of snowy ridges, landslides, and narrow passes, but their accounts often contradict one another. Without clear landmarks or reliable maps, we cannot trace the path from texts alone. That is why researchers now combine science with history, searching for physical clues in the high mountain soil. Soil layers bring some of the strongest insights. At the Col de la Traversette, a 950-meter pass linking France and Italy, teams uncovered a churned band of peat dating to the early 3rd century BC. Within it, they found signatures of horse and mule dung, Clostridia bacteria, bile acids, and disrupted plant layering that match the movement of thousands of pack animals. This is not definitive proof of elephants, but when dated alongside Hannibal's era, it suggests an extraordinary traffic of animals across a landscape where such scale would otherwise be unlikely. Geologists have also studied the terrain. Polybius describes a rock slide that temporarily blocked Hannibal's march. At the Traversette, there is evidence of a large fall dating close to the 3rd century BC. The debris here contains pale stone matching ancient descriptions of a white rock place, an alignment that strengthens the argument for this pass. Such geological markers are rare, but they create a chain of hints linking written accounts to actual ridges. Botanical research adds another piece. Pollen samples taken from the Traversette reveal sudden traces of Mediterranean plants, including types associated with human and animal transport. These do not grow naturally at this altitude, so their presence points to travelers carrying them up from lower valleys. Elephants themselves leave little lasting evidence, but seeds within dung and fodder could survive in microfragments. No equally strong signals have appeared at other candidate passes. Climate evidence supports the picture. Alpine ice cores suggest that 218 BC witnessed early snowfall. Ancient authors describe men and animals struggling through snow earlier than expected, which narrows the range of feasible paths. Climate models match these conditions most closely at Traversette, where storms can arrive sooner than in nearby valleys. Not all scholars agree. The Col du Clapier, a lower crossing at about 2,400 meters, appears more practical for large animals, and some historians have long favored it. But LiDAR mapping shows many stretches there would have been too narrow for an army with baggage trains. By contrast, Traversette offers wider ledges where camps could have been pitched, matching Polybius' note of halts along the ascent. Other studies lend further weight. Sediments from Traversette hold parasite eggs, including liver flukes, which normally thrive far below such heights. Their arrival is best explained by animals carrying them upward, again hinting at unusual traffic across the pass in this period. Taken together, these signs do not give us certainty but form a compelling picture. Several multidisciplinary studies, microbial, radiocarbon, geomorphological, strongly suggest the Col de la Traversette as the likeliest route. Yet scholarly debate remains very much alive, and alternatives are not ruled out. Importantly, no smoking gun has ever been found. No skeleton or artifact can be tied directly to Hannibal's elephants. The evidence is circumstantial, built from many fields converging on the same high valley. Work continues. Genetic testing of dung layers may one day confirm species, and soil isotope studies might distinguish elephants from horses. Ground-penetrating radar could uncover past encampments. Each step adds refinement rather than finality. What this tells us is that Hannibal's feat grows more vivid, not less, under scrutiny. Science has helped us picture what it meant for animals and men to move through snow and stone at those altitudes. And yet, beyond the data, the elephants themselves still carry a hold over our imagination, long after their trail has faded. Why do Hannibal's elephants still hold our attention after 2,000 years? Their fascination endures because they sit somewhere between history and legend. We know they were real animals that walked across real mountains, yet over time they have become something larger than life. The facts alone are remarkable, but it is the layered meanings we have given them that sustain their presence in memory. Writers and artists repeatedly returned to the image. Roman historians viewed them as military instruments, measuring worth in tactical terms. Soon after, poets wrote of them as though they were mythical creatures, bearing guards across frozen landscapes. That shift from weapon to wonder shows us how extraordinary events often need both factual record and imaginative retelling before we feel their full impact. Centuries later, the stories did not fade. Renaissance painters cast elephants as symbols of wisdom. Baroque musicians placed them in performances as emblems of grandeur. Enlightenment thinkers debated their place in nature's order, while more recent filmmakers reshaped them into tragic figures or comic scenes depending on the story at hand. Each age reimagined them in its own image, but always with their essential aura of the impossible made real. Part of the appeal lies in psychology. Studies show that when human ambition meets the scale of nature, the image tends to last. Elephants trudging through snow combine those two forces, human will and natural grandeur, in a single frame. That contrast alone helps explain why you still recall it long after hearing the story. Their visual weight matters too. Even now, elephants gather crowds when seen in parks or sanctuaries. Imagine that impact magnified in 218 BC, when whole communities had never conceived of such a beast. Carthaginian coins, Etruscan pottery, even imported art in Gallic regions carried their forms. The shape alone quickly became shorthand for the extraordinary. Still, there is a divide between tale and truth. Over centuries, retellings sometimes amplified their numbers and deeds, an expected feature of legend-making. The actual herd was smaller, their passage grimmer, their losses immense. Yet the beauty of memory is that it preserves wonder even while sanding away hardship. As Carthage declined in later recollection, the elephants rose in importance. In some medieval accounts they eclipsed Hannibal himself, perhaps because animals carry meaning without the burden of human politics. Their hardship felt easier to admire, their loyalty easier to frame as noble. Our own time echoes this instinct. Modern war footage often highlights animals, horses, dogs, even birds, as symbols of endurance or innocence. Climate narratives do the same with polar bears and whales. Hannibal's elephants fill that role for the ancient world, letting us think about the vast costs of ambition through the figure of creatures who could not choose their fate. The fascination also links to childhood stories. Elephants often appear in early tales across cultures, connected with memory, wisdom, and patience. That early introduction primes us to meet them again in history and find them resonant. When science adds insights into their intelligence and strong bonds, it only deepens the emotional weight of placing them on Alpine trails. In classrooms, their role continues. Teachers use them as a hook that fixes the campaign in students' memories. Few remember the exact names of mountain passes, but most remember the image of grey hide against snow. That simple contrast keeps the lesson alive. Perhaps the most striking fact of all, Carthage itself is gone, reduced to ruins and records, but its elephants remain vivid, passed down in art, stories, and teaching. They endure because they symbolize more than one empire's struggle. They represent power and fragility, mastery and suffering, human drive and its limits. And beneath all the fascination lies a reminder. What drew us to them was not only their size or strangeness, but how much they cost to bring forward. For every story told about survival and spectacle, there is another about loss. That balance leads us quietly toward a different question: what the price of such ambition truly was. Hannibal's vision carried a weight that is easy to admire from a distance, but harder to measure up close. The price of that ambition stretched well beyond strategy and glory. It meant lives, human and animal, were pressed past endurance for the sake of a single gamble, and the traces of that cost remain as part of the story. The elephants themselves bore the sharpest strain. Ancient sources agree that only a minority survived the Alpine passage. The rest were lost to hunger, cold, exhaustion, or fatal slips along the cliffs. For such creatures, adapted to warmer climates and steady ground, the ordeal was harsh in ways we can only imagine. They stood day after day in snow and thin air, pulled forward by handlers who could keep them calm but could not shield them from the biting conditions. Those handlers, the mahouts, faced their own risks. They had lived beside their animals, guiding them since youth, and on the mountain paths their roles became perilous. A panicked elephant weighed many tons, and men who tried to steady them often lost their lives. Ancient anecdotal notes even hint at handlers choosing not to abandon their elephants in final moments. Whether factual or symbolic, such accounts reflect the deep toll on individuals who were bound not just to an army, but to the animals themselves. Supporting such a force also meant sacrifices elsewhere. Elephants consumed staggering amounts of food. To supply them, forage parties had to scour the land, often leaving soldiers with less. Timber was cut for rafts, bridges, and path building, all demanding time and labor that slowed the advance. Contemporary accounts and modern reconstructions suggest local woodlands and grazing grounds were pressed to the limit, reshaped by thousands of men and animals passing through. The presence of elephants magnified this strain, making every logistical break more acute. Communities along the route felt this burden too. Some gave willingly, persuaded by Hannibal's promises of alliance. Many others had their stores seized or their lands stripped bare for the sake of the column. Feeding tens of thousands of men was already heavy work for host populations. Adding the elephants only deepened the demand. For some villages, cooperation with Hannibal's army was less a choice and more a necessity after their resources had been consumed. The elephants that reached Italy carried the marks of trauma as much as the people did. Chroniclers describe survivors hesitant at streams or wary of steep ground. Handlers noted temperaments shift. Animals once calm grew unpredictable, troubled by the loss of their herd and the ordeals behind them. These were intelligent beings aware of absence, forced back into war even after enduring what would have broken most others. What resulted on the battlefield did not always repay the cost. The spectacle at Trebia showed that elephants could unsettle Roman formations. But as months went on, their numbers dwindled and Romans adapted. The immense resources used to bring them across yielded only limited advantage in the campaigns that followed. In this light, their suffering becomes even more stark. Enormous effort for fleeting tactical effect. Hannibal's choice reminds us of ambition's paradox. What set his march apart also weakened it. Achieving a feat deemed impossible won him awe and fear. Yet the weight of keeping those animals alive sapped strength he could ill afford to lose. His brilliance lay in imagining the impossible. His weakness lay in bearing the cost of sustaining it. So when we remember this campaign, it is not enough to see triumph alone. We should also count what was spent. The elephants freezing on slopes, the handlers risking everything to steady them, the villagers watching their lands stripped. The Alpine crossing was not only one of history's daring feats, it was also a moment in which lives, both human and animal, bore the cost of another man's vision. And this brings us back to the creatures themselves. To understand what they endured and why they could survive at all, we have to look more closely at who they were, their bodies, their traits, and the strange mixture of strength and fragility they carried into the mountains. Hannibal's elephants were not mythical beasts. They were real animals with very real biological limits. Most scholars believe his herd consisted mainly of smaller North African elephants, sometimes called forest elephants. These animals stood shorter than their Indian or savanna relatives, perhaps nearer 2.5 meters at the shoulder. That smaller size may have helped them on narrow cliffside tracks compared to the bulkier kinds seen elsewhere, but it did not make them suited to alpine cold or high altitudes. Their larger challenge was not height or strength, but the resources their bodies demanded. A healthy elephant consumes enormous amounts each day. Modern estimates suggest close to 300 pounds of vegetation. On top of that, several dozen gallons of water are normally required. Supplying such needs in snowy passes was almost impossible. Soldiers and handlers struggled to cut branches, gather brush, or soak grain to feed them, and the sheer volume slowed the entire army. Wherever the army halted, the ground had to provide for both men and beasts, and the elephant's constant hunger pressed hardest of all. Ancient and modern writers alike note how elephants' digestive systems are inefficient. Much of what they swallow passes through without yielding full nutrition, which means they must eat almost constantly. For an army marching at pace, every delay to let the animals feed on Alpine scrub risked lost initiative against Rome. The handlers improvised when they could, mixing odd rations or watering with whatever streams they found, though the cold and thin forage left many animals weakened by the time they reached the Italian plains. Malnutrition lingered as an invisible burden after losses to terrain and frost. These elephants carried both strengths and vulnerabilities in their bodies. Their thick hide gave some protection against arrows or javelins, yet cold harmed them quickly. Exposed tips of ears and tails suffered from frostbite, and the dark skin that normally helped shed heat in Africa meant little in the thin mountain light. Mahouts kept up constant care, rubbing oils and wrapping what they could, but mountain weather left brutal marks. Some animals recovered, many others did not. Crossing rivers posed another test. Sources describe elephants entering deep currents, at times loaded on rafts, at times swimming. Here the trunk gave a natural advantage. Acting like a snorkel, it allowed them to breathe while submerged, and modern observers note how this feature let them cross when other animals would drown. This ability helps explain why they eventually managed the Rhone, though even then, panic among individuals meant crossings were tense and dangerous. The herd's social traits shaped outcomes too. In nature, elephants rely on close bonds led by matriarchs. Military life fractured these groups, pairing unfamiliar animals and driving them in forced marches. Stress rose sharply, and handlers had to step in constantly to prevent disorder. Some elephants proved steadier leaders, guiding others across ice or down slopes, while the loss of a single experienced animal could unsettle those marching behind. Cohesion of the herd mattered as much as their strength, making the Mahout's bond a vital part of survival. Biologists today suggest that stress left long-term imprints on these survivors. Accounts from later campaigns describe elephants more erratic, with sudden aggression or hesitation that may reflect lasting trauma from the Alpine ordeal. Scars on bodies were visible, but changes in behavior showed something deeper. Creatures stretched beyond natural limits, adapted only through constant human support. So when we picture Hannibal's march, it is not a simple story of animals as tools. Their biology dictated pace, rationing, and morale. They shaped the march as much as weather or terrain did, and their survival into battle rested on careful management day by day. That balance between what nature allowed and what handlers demanded set the backdrop for the next element in this story, when the attention shifts from animal strength to the commander whose decisions guided all. Hannibal's command was defined as much by his leadership as by his strategy. He held together an army of different peoples, speaking different tongues, and moving across impossible terrain beside animals few had ever seen. In these conditions, leadership was not about lofty orders. It was about presence, judgment, and knowing when to act through others. He delegated to specialists, walking difficult routes with his men, and relied on local guides who knew the mountains better than his officers. Mahouts directed the elephants without interference, while Celtic scouts pointed the way through snowfields and narrow valleys. Hannibal set the overall aim, but allowed trusted hands to decide the details. This kind of distributed authority is exactly what kept the column moving when a rigid top-down command might have stalled. Ancient accounts describe him placing himself at the very front when crises struck. At river crossings, he was seen urging elephants forward by standing nearby, as if to prove safety by example. During rock slides, he did not sit apart, but labored alongside soldiers to clear paths. Such choices were symbolic, but they carried weight. Men believed more deeply in a leader who endured the same strain beside them. He also balanced boldness with restraint. Every day in the Alps required judgment, wait in a blizzard or push forward, rush weakened animals or protect them at the cost of time. Hannibal seldom pursued perfection. He moved steadily, sacrificing some to preserve the whole. It was a form of pragmatism that favored endurance over display. What set him apart was how he held together a force made of Iberians, Celts, Numidians, and Carthaginians, groups with long histories of rivalry. Here the elephants themselves became symbols of unity. Their care mattered to all, cutting across divisions. By focusing attention on these rare animals, Hannibal gave his soldiers a shared task and a shared pride. Everyone had a stake in protecting them. Archaeological traces hint at the same attentiveness. Excavations of temporary camps suggest orderly layouts, with elephant enclosures placed near rivers, but apart from horses likely to startle at their presence. Simple arrangements like these point to a leader who planned for cross-species needs, rather than leaving them to chance. Nothing was too small to consider, whether fodder piles, sleeping areas, or the spacing of different groups. Hannibal could not stop the losses, but he framed them in ways that strengthened morale. When most elephants perished in the mountains, he chose to highlight the few that endured, recasting survival as evidence of possibility. This reframing mattered. Armies rarely last long under constant deficit. His soldiers followed not because conditions were easy, but because he gave them reasons to think their hardships had meaning. Contemporary writers noted too his calm with the animals. Elephants respond to patience and consistency more than to force, and Hannibal insisted handlers use steady guidance rather than harsh methods. Later Carthaginian generals tried to imitate his tactics, but without this same care their elephants faltered. What others missed was that method and style could matter more than the idea itself. Today we might compare his approach to what military thinkers call mission command, a style where leaders set goals and let others find their way to them. For Hannibal, this was not theory, it was necessity. Every new bend of the mountains forced improvisation. His gift was to trust expertise around him while never losing sight of what all were working toward. In Italy, he adjusted again. With fewer elephants and shifting conditions, he used them more sparingly, placing them where their impact was greatest rather than expecting them to decide battles alone. This willingness to alter tactics showed the same pragmatism that had carried him through the pass itself. The lessons of his leadership remain in how he combined competence, courage, and care. He asked no more of his men than he bore himself. He trusted them with decisions. He kept attention on the shared journey when differences could have fractured his army, and by doing so, he carried them across ground most had thought impassable. So when we speak of Hannibal's march, it is not just a tale of weapons or terrain. It is a study in how leadership transforms struggle into possibility, and how choices in the hardest hours echo long after. From here, we can turn back to the elephants themselves, not only as animals of war, but as symbols that carried the weight of an idea far larger than Carthage alone. In the end, what remains is not just a tale of strategy, but of endurance and loss. The elephant's crossing shows us how far human will compress against nature, and how much is surrendered in that attempt. They remind us that ambition can move armies over mountains, but always at a cost carried by those within it. Their story asks us not only to admire the scale of the feat, but to reflect on what it consumed. They were instruments of war and symbols of audacity, and their story asks us to weigh the wonder against the cost. If this felt restful and curious, subscribe for more calm history.